Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and as I've shared with you before, Steve Durbin, Managing Director of ISF, and I, rather than recording together in the studio as we usually do, are continuing our production schedule from a healthy social distance, Steve outside of London and I in New York. We wanted to bring you a little bit of bonus content, our most recent conversation regarding the flexibility this pandemic demands of all of us, the increased threat of cyber attackers, and how governments are responding to the virus, among other topics. You might notice a few minor sound glitches due to our two-continent recording setup, but we hope that you'll keep listening.
Yeah, over in the UK, the hospitals are being given another 6 months to complete some of their annual cybersecurity checks and things as well. So there is a sort of relaxing of rules around it.
What are your thoughts about that?
I think I think the challenge you face is that if you were working in an environment where there weren't any bad guys who didn't see an opportunity, then it would be absolutely fine. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world anymore, and there are lots of opportunities for them. And so I think that that's just opening up a door that perhaps could have remained locked. But it's a tough call, because what are you going to do? And it is, to the US side of things, it is a very useful and indeed increasingly well accepted way of doctors reaching out to patients. But there is clearly a security issue that needs to be observed. But in a situation like this, where do you go,
Well, so there's a skills shortage and there's not a fleet of people out in the world to advise quickly unless there is. What do people do about the skills shortage? What can smart businesses bring in quickly to start to address the need for greater transparency and teleworking options and still keeping things safe? Where do people who have never had to implement stuff like this start?
Yeah, that is indeed the question. Where do they start?
Do they call you?
And they, my number will be available at the end. Yeah.
At the,
No, I think that they probably start with their IT guy, right? Now, who's that? Well, it's probably going to be a son or a daughter. It could be the guy down the street that they happen to know. I mean, when we're talking about small businesses, that's where it's going to come from, and then it goes from there. So there probably isn't anybody who is completely on their own in terms of who to go to. But the issue is, what skill level do they have, and therefore are you implementing a solution that is appropriate, secure, all of those good things. And then you have to fall back on the internet. And that's why you've got different agencies putting stuff out there. I think I saw Trend Micro today putting something out that says, you can download our stuff for free for 6 months that will at least, give you a degree of security on your laptop or whatever it might be. So I think that some of the suppliers are actually doing their bit, which is good to see. But you've still got to, go through that and load it up and off you go. And that means you have to, first of all, think about the fact that there might be a security issue.
Right.
And with everything else going on, that probably is not at the top of your list of priorities. And again, the cyber criminals know that. So it is really, really difficult, I think, because, when we talk about people having been set up for remote working, we're talking about such a small percentage. We really are.
Yeah.
It really is a first world problem. And, there is probably no organization out there that ever planned for its entire workforce globally to be working from home.
Yeah.
Never happened. And then you've got the guys who've never worked from home anyway.
Right.
So it is an interesting one.
It's a big problem. It's a big potential opportunity, I think, too. If it drives people to best practices that they had never prioritized because something was always happening tomorrow. Well, here it's happening now. So people can choose.
Yeah, do you think, though? Do you think, I mean, if you talk about the individual, you talk about the small business, do Do you not think that there's a significant proportion? I mean, it's very similar to COVID-19, really. Why is it that countries have had to insist on lockdowns? Well, it's because people refuse to accept either that they're vulnerable or indeed that it will happen to them. And the same, actually, there's a parallel with that in cybersecurity. I haven't been attacked. So, and why should it happen to me? What have I got that's of any interest to anybody? I'll be fine. I'll just carry on going as I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is some of that mentality that to a certain extent is just human. That's the biggest challenge. And that's actually why I've always been so very interested in the human element of it all, because the industry has tended to ignore that in favor of technology solving the problem.
Right.
Technology doesn't solve problems. Not at all. It exacerbates them, actually, 9 times out of 10, in my view. But people solve problems. Technology doesn't.
That's really interesting. I don't know that you've ever articulated that point so clearly before, but that really is a surprising and rational way of seeing the contemporary world.
I do think, actually, that one of the positive outcomes from COVID-19 will be that people will perhaps realize that, the human element, the natural element, has a probably more significant role to play in society than technology. And I think that it had moved too far the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Technology should only ever be a tool. When we'd got to the point where people couldn't even go out for dinner without putting a damn phone on the table and, checking that constantly, something was very, very wrong. And I do wonder what the world will be like post-COVID-19.
Do you think this will break that? I don't want to say it's an addiction because it's not that.
Oh, it is an addiction.
Well, it
Of course
is,
it's
but
an
it's
addiction.
also, yes, it certainly is, but I think there's something more. It's a real tension in our society of how are we going to view human beings? You and I started this conversation talking about the absurdity of the political situation, that we're being asked to look at this as, do we save life or do we continue the economy? And that the human element, the humanity is for some people so present. How do we work together? How do we take care of our vulnerable neighbors? How do we contribute from a distance versus what are we willing to sacrifice for technology, for our economy, for big systems? Sometimes I feel like the people who are making up these enormous systems of technology in which we're all engaging and that run our global economy want us to be machines, and we will never be. That tension is so present. So how do we bring back humanity and resist saying, I'm not going to become my iPhone. I'm going to be a human being and put the technology away.
Well, it's interesting because you touch on that whole point around control. And control is fundamental in a lot of the things we're talking about, it seems to me. If you go back, I think I mentioned this to you before, if you go back to 17th century, for instance, then business was transacted in people's homes and in coffee shops. That was the way you did it, and it was very trust-based. And then at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the bosses decided that they really needed a better way of controlling the workforce. And so they put them into buildings that transformed into offices in the way that we do work today. And so the whole nature of the office environment is one that is founded upon control, because if you've got people in the office, you can physically see them, you can monitor what they're doing, and therefore you can control them. And some businesses are more attuned to that than others, because you clock in at a certain time if you're thinking about a manufacturing environment, and you're allowed certain breaks and all this kind of thing. But the whole focus is on control and how you get the human, the individual, to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've put everybody out into the wild. So how do you now control them out there? And what's been quite interesting for me has been the way in which governments have been trying to do that, particularly around COVID-19 and whether or not people have been infected and so on. So we've seen sort of apps being introduced that are widespread in places like Singapore, in Israel, for instance, to monitor movements in Korea, all of this kind of thing. And that raises issues around control and privacy. And you have to ask the question, and people seem to have been quite happy for that to be rolled out,
Mm-hmm.
because there is a usefulness to it. But it's an extension of control, you could argue. So when you get post-pandemic, are we going to see a rolling back of that, or is that now going to be the new norm? Is that the way that we now control things? Because if it is, then I do believe that certain people will switch off. So if the way that if you control me is via my mobile phone, well, now when I'm going out in the evening, I'll leave the phone behind.
Mm-hmm.
So how will you know where I am? Well, the answer, of course, is because you'll have picked me up on a CCTV camera, or I'll use my a credit card, and all this kind of thing. But the issue is a societal one. It is all about control of the individual, and the real challenge is, what is the role of the individual, therefore, going forward? And so this is sort of, all of the issues that were being talked about around GDPR and CCPA in California and the other laws right the way across the states. This is it on steroids, because you do have control that's being implemented masquerading as a caring, nurturing government. But is it? Or employer, for that matter? So there are really big questions, I think, that the whole thing begins to ask, from a philosophical standpoint, from a human standpoint, from a psychological perspective, just about, the relationship that people have developed with technology, that people have developed because of technology with each other, and the role of government in all of that. And how it pans out, I have no idea.
I think it's really an interesting point to think. As you said, our administration is flirting with the idea of sending American workers back well before health experts recommend we do so that we, quote unquote, restart our economy, turn it back on, like flipping a light switch. We have these tools. You and I are recording this by Zoom right now. We're using these tools to keep us working, and that is in many ways a blessing. We need to continue to work for all sorts of reasons for our very survival. But the fact that we can also creates demands that we will continue business as usual in enormously shifted circumstances. So technology is driving culture, politics, social health, because it's this veneer of, well, we can all continue to work. So what's really the problem? I'm not seeing the outcome of this. I donated a box of latex gloves to the hospital that I had, but I'm not seeing what's happening. I can read a Twitter feed, but it's so far, I am not experiencing ill health or around people who are. So it still feels very surreal when we're asked to
Also,
stay home.
yeah, but also, you're talking about a fraction of the population. That's the other thing to bear in mind. You're talking about a fraction of the population that can be a remote worker, that can be a technology-enabled worker. If you happen to be working on the railways, on the underground system, if you're in sewage or you're, water, any of the utilities, you have to go to work, okay? Because the rest of society needs that.
Right.
And so when we talk about remote working, as if it's this great panacea that's going to solve the world's problems, it's a fraction of the population we're talking about doing that. And when you get into a situation like this one, where you've got a global pandemic, where people's, health is at risk, there's always the discussion that I think perhaps is overlooked, which is, well, where we come from, the security, what's happening with security. Well, actually, what's happening with the physical security of people who have to go to work, whether they're working in the health service or whether they're working anywhere else? They don't have a buffer that sits between me and you. You could have all sorts of things wrong with you. I'm not going to catch it because I'm not in the same room, not even in the same continent. That isn't the case if you happen to be working in a hospital, for instance.
Right.
And so there is that whole element too. And I think when people talk about, getting people back to work or flipping a switch on an economy again, it's just worth remembering that parts of the economy were never allowed to shut down anyway.
Yes.
And we never worried too much about the risks that they were susceptible to.
We're absolutely not.
A ridiculous situation, as far as I can see, in London, whereby the mayor of London has reduced the amount of underground trains in order to discourage people from using them.
So the trains that run are more congested?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So what is the solution? Well, according to this bright individual, the solution is now to put the police at the entrance to tubes to reduce the number of people that go down onto the tube.
Mm.
No, the answer is not to do that at all. The answer is to put back the train schedule that you had in the first place,
Yeah.
so that you can actually spread key workers going to work, not force them into a small number of carriages and then throw the problem at the police force to resolve.
Right.
It's a nonsense. And so we have got all sorts of, quirky behavior that's coming about as a result of this. And, that's just the way that it is.
Well, and here our medical experts are working with no protective covering. People are sewing masks with their home sewing machines and taking cotton masks to the hospital. I really dread what will happen when our frontline forces get sick. I want people to be looking at science and an actual effort to be thinking about this systemically, logically, and long term. And I think we are seeing what happens when we want our workforces to be under our control, so much so that we are in absolute denial. We, meaning our leaders. Denial will not save us. Staying home
No,
will.
it's interesting, because it is all about, as I said, control. And this, for me, is an example of how mankind, if you like, is trying to control nature.
Yeah.
You can't control nature. You can try as you might. Nature always wins.
Mm-hmm.
And all you can do, it's a bit like swimming against the tide. You will gradually become exhausted. However, if you were to turn and swim with the tide, you would go a lot further, a lot more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It may not take you to the destination you'd originally had planned, but you'll have to adapt along the way. And that's one of the things that I think we've forgotten, the need to adapt. And so, we have to get back to, the markets have to stay open. All of those old norms that are there have to be observed. And sometimes you just have to admit that you can't do that. You have to do something different. You've got to work around it. You've got to just go with things, go with the flow from time to time and see where it takes you.
We don't know where this will end up, but I do have hope that people will learn that lesson, that people will think about how they can be flexible, how they can be like water. You can't control nature, and water will go everywhere. We really have to call on our better angels right now. And I hope that people individually will have a willingness to do so, and that people in leadership will somehow get there.
I think only time will tell, really.
Yeah. These are weird times.
I think it's different. As I say, it's all about flexibility at the moment. And I think the people who struggle are probably the ones that expect it to stay the same, because it won't, it can't.
That concludes today's episode, a remote conversation with Steve Durbin of the ISF and myself, Tavia Gilbert. We will continue to change in the ways we need to bring you ongoing content during strange and confusing times. We're glad you're with us. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it in your networks. Be sure to visit securityforum.org to join the conversation on our LinkedIn group, and take a look at the show notes and download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance around security best practices, even during a pandemic. Wishing you, your loved ones, and your communities peace and good health. Till next time.